Hello and welcome to another episode of Attacking Third, a CBS Sports soccer podcast. I'm Sandra Herrera, lead NWSL writer for CBS Sports, joined today, as always, by my colleague and co-host Lisa Roman, NWSL analyst and broadcaster. On today's episode, we are continuing the rollout of our team-by-team previews ahead of the NWSL 2022 season, and today we're going to be diving into Portland Thorns FC. But before we get into all that, a quick reminder to follow us on Twitter for all breaking news at Attacking Third. And if you're listening to this as a podcast, please give us a 5-star rating and review. It takes just a second and it really helps us out. You can do that on Apple Podcasts, 5-star rating /review, and on Spotify right on the Attacking Third page. So go ahead and give us 5 stars if you're able. Lisa, we're just cranking these out. We're talking team by team. Preseason is like officially in swing. It feels like it just started yesterday, but here we are. We're going to chat a little bit about Portland Thorns coming up now.
It really does. And I like that we get to dive deep into each team and look at the nuances of the roster and formation structure that we see fitting. And it just gets me so hyped and amped up for the season and to actually watch these teams compete. We have Challenge Cup schedule. We have games on the calendar. We have a start date for the season. It's just exciting. Finally, we are here with it. In 2 weeks with full preseason underway at this point. So the players are in a little bit of a groove. The clubs are in a little bit of a groove. The teams are really just back into the swing of things. And so are we here at Attacking Third. We're in like full season mode, even though it's just preseason, but like we go hard here.
Yeah, we're definitely like in it now. Like we're of the frame of mind where we're like, yeah, off season's over. Like that's a wrap. It came and it went. Like it's full. Like it's game time, right? Soccer never sleeps. Let's talk about Portland Thorns FC looking ahead into the 2022 season. Let's do a little bit of an overview first before we get into some actual roster type of things. Team overview: the head coach, Rhain Wilkinson, former Canadian international, England women's national team assistant coach, got brought on into fill some pretty big shoes for Mark Parson, the former head coach of Portland Thorns. So new head coach into 2022 for Portland. It's going to be her first season with the Thorns after Mark Parson spent 6 seasons before moving on to the Netherlands women's national team head coaching position. Other notable hires for the team over the offseason included the introduction of Karina LeBlanc as general manager, the former Canadian international goalkeeper, former head of CONCACAF W, and also a former Portland Thorn herself, coming in to fill the roles of Gavin Wilkinson after he stepped away per player request in light of ongoing investigations and so on. In terms of their actual on the pitch finish in 2021, it was a lot of wins, right? When we were following the Thorns in 2021, we had them pegged as really the team to beat. We had them pegged as this could be a team of destiny in their own right, in terms of they were just winning everything in front of them. We're talking starting off with a 2021 Challenge Cup win. We're talking winning the Shield down the stretch of things, right? In the middle of the season, being crowned WICC title holders. But they ended up losing in the NWSL Championship final to Chicago Red Stars 2-0. So it was a very impressive season in 2021 on the pitch for the Portland Thorns, in light of so many things going on surrounding clubs during that 2021 season. But to fall maybe just short of that final prize maybe leaves a little bit of a bittersweet taste in the mouth. And then for our way too early power rankings in December, despite all that, before some of these changes even came to light, Lisa, we put them at number 3.
We did. And I think when you look at 2021 as a whole for Portland, they almost did a full sweep, going for 4 with their trophies, and the 4 being Challenge Cup, NWSL Shield, Women's WICC, and then the NWSL Championship. They fell short. They didn't get to the NWSL Championship. They were out in the semifinals, as you mentioned, but I don't think that it really was that surprising. I mean, looking at the season of Washington and Chicago and what they did last year, how they were able to kind of power through towards the end. But it was a bit surprising for Portland. And I know it was very bittersweet for Mark Parsons to end his tenure with Portland Thorns on a maybe a sour taste in his mouth just because he didn't get to the NWSL final. I don't think so, though, because so much success. He is a player, or is a coach that the players spoke so highly of. But I know now they're pretty pumped to have Wilkinson into the fray and having a female coach, right? And that's huge. And the players talked about that. They said it's really fun and different and interesting to have female coaches. Which is interesting. But yeah, we put him at 3 back in December before any of these changes made. We'll talk through them. We're going to talk through about the biggest roster signings that they have, the biggest losses that Portland suffered player-wise and personnel-wise on the pitch. Take a look at the preseason roster that they put out. Maybe take a look at formations, starting players that have locks in there, changes that we could see made, international players, our biggest burning question. And we're going to circle back on our number 3rd ranking to see if that's their projected finish for 2022 based on all of the changes, because every single club in the NWSL faced a lot of changes in this offseason with the expansion draft, with the college draft happening, and now 12 teams in the NWSL. Yeah. There's a lot of pressure for these clubs to perform. And I think there's a lot of pressure on Portland to perform and to do as well as they have been traditionally. They're a powerhouse club in the NWSL. And now with new management, new front office, new coaches, can they live up to that hype? It's not our burning question.
Yeah.
It's just another question I have and
no,
like
I don't
to look at.
Look, I don't think that's unfair to throw out there at all. I mean, that's something I think that a lot of people are going to be looking at in 2022 as the league finds itself expanding with 2 extra teams in the mix. And it's sort of really being viewed as the new era of NWSL, this era in which maybe this was the expansion year that is finally going to sort of thin out, right? And maybe really truly kind of even some things out in terms of the competition. It's always been a league built on its competitive angles and the fact that there's a ton of parity, but it was still a league that very often saw a couple of teams always in the mix down the end of the stretch. And one of those teams has constantly been the Portland Thorns. So we'll see. Let's take a look at maybe how some of the signings, maybe some of the departures could impact this club in the 2022 season in terms of their breakout roster signings, whether it's offseason signings or rookies that are coming into the fold or re-signing of veterans. In terms of their draft, they have Hannah Belfort that they're going to be welcoming into the fold, the 37th pick in the 2021 draft out of Wake Forest. Midfielder Sam Coffey, midfielder out of PSU, 12th pick overall in the 2021 draft. And probably maybe the biggest one, I think, for you and I are agreeing on this one in terms of the signings that they're bringing into the fold was Hina Sugita, the Japanese international, not just only being this acquisition that they made in the offseason, but introducing her with a 3-year contract with the Portland Thorns, so longevity, with this player that they want to really continue to build with this club moving forward. In terms of detrimental, perhaps biggest losses from the roster, I mean, Portland's just like any other team, right, that entered this offseason. It was a ton of departures, some different farewells that they had to make. And that included with forwards Simone Charlie and Tyler Lucy to Angel City, defender Kristen Westphal to San Diego Wave, and the rights to forward Amir Ali to San Diego Wave FC. And that's all before something like the retirement of Angela Sala came into play, and then the eventual departure of Lindsay Haran on an 18-month loan to Olympique Lyonnais came into play. So, I mean, you're looking at the signings, the acquisitions, right, the additions compared to maybe some of the losses of this club, Lisa. What is standing out in terms of these 2 categories for you the most?
Well, looking at it honestly chronologically, how the news came out, how this went down with Portland Thorns, and even how we're talking about it, they signed a player like Hina Sugita before they lost and had some big losses in their midfield. She is a Japanese international midfielder. She's a young player. She's only 24 years old, but she has a lot of international experience, which I think she could provide a lot of depth for Portland in that midfield. She's a player, Sugita, that Karina LeBlanc and Coach Wilkinson said that they had their eye on for a while. And in the Portland system, they were keeping an eye on her, keeping track of her games, her international duties at the international level. She's played in youth World Cups. She was at the Tokyo 2020 Olympics and 2019 Women's World Cup. So she has so much experience at only 24 years old. So I think she will provide so much for them. She's their biggest signing for me, hands down. Just looking at the other players that they signed and that we talked about, they were college players that hopefully can make an impact and do big things in the league. But I think having a Japanese international in Sugita could bring a nice look for Portland that they need, especially in their midfield, because that takes me to the biggest losses that Portland suffered, and it's their midfield. There's Swiss cheese holds now in this midfield for Portland. You mentioned a number of different players: Simone Charlie, Tyler Lucy, Kristen Westphal. These are big players that played a big role for Portland last year. However, someone like a Simone Charlie, even a Tyler Lucy, they weren't the superstar strikers. It's not a Sophia Smith, even a Morgan Weaver. So these holes can be filled. But when you look at the midfield, in Angela Salem retiring, which was not a surprise. If you knew her, if you were her teammate, a lot of her Portland teammates saw this coming. She wanted one more season under her belt, a good season with Portland, and now she steps aside so she can focus on her other career. And then also Lindsay Haran, although she signed another deal with Portland Thorns, a contract extension, she is on loan for 18 months. So she is out of the picture for 2022 for Portland Thorns. So losing one of the best defensive fielders in NWSL in Angela Salem, and then losing one of the most creative playmakers in the attacking midfield position in Lindsay Haran, that's a really big hole to fill in the midfield for Portland. And I think Hina Sugita could provide some support in the midfield, but I don't think she can fill both of those holes left by Salem and Haran. So outweighing one versus the other, frankly, if that's what we're looking at, I think the loss is bigger for Portland in their midfield. And which players are going to step up, because they've relied on Salem for years to be the engine in the midfield and to be the one that makes those defensive stops, to starts the play on offense. She's just been the destroyer, right? She was categorized as an MVP at the end of the 2021 season. And also Lindsay Haran, U.S. Women's National Team player. She's going over to get some Champions League experience, which is great for her game, but it does leave a lot of question marks at Portland. So I think the midfield is the biggest circle I'm putting on my whiteboard for Portland, and kind of saying, how can they work around this midfield? And that might change their projected finish at the end of 22 based on what they can do with the holes in midfield.
No, I'm with you 100% on that. I think the midfield for Portland is going to be the area in which a lot of people keep their eye on. Like, how is that middle third going to look moving forward in 2022? Especially, like you said, with somebody without a Salem in the mix. You know, this was someone who really is retiring off of a season where she was nominated for MVP, and this is coming after a lengthy amount of time as a player in NWSL, and it took getting to a place like Portland to be able to play alongside other players to sort of continue help elevating your game, to kind of have this it almost felt like maybe, now I'm not referring to it as a breakout season by any means, because clearly it came during her last season of play, but it was almost like a bit of a reintroduction perhaps for people who kind of maybe forgot about the type of impact that a player like Salem could bring, because this is someone who made her arrival to Portland after the Boston Breakers folded, ceased operations, came through via, like an expansion draft, and had to also navigate injury, right? So it wasn't someone who was able to really maybe, make that type of significant impact in the ways that she really did if we center in on that 21 season, and it didn't really matter who was kind of slotting in with and around her, right? Whether it was somebody like a Haran, a Sinclair, a Rodriguez, right? Even we got to see at times a Moultrie sub in, right, for a player of that caliber. So I think there's a lot of questions surrounding that middle third for sure, and we're going to keep an eye on it moving forward. Let's take a look though at this preseason roster overall, right? My favorite part of the preseason, where we get to see a ton of names, right, and have to guess who's gonna, still, be part of the team moving forward. Obviously, these rosters get, waved down a little bit as March 1st comes around, and then Challenge Cup looms closer. But in terms of their preseason, maybe a little bit shorter than preseasons past. 24 players listed out for the Portland Thorns. Start with the goalkeepers with Bella Bixby, Shelby Hogan, and Abby Smith. Defenders at 7, Kelly Hubley, Megan Klingenberg, Natalia Cuica, Emily Menges, Megan Nally, Madison Pogarch, and Becky Sauerbrunn. For the midfielders, they have 8, Sam Coffey, they have Crystal Dunn listed, Olivia Moultrie, Gabby Provenzano, Rocky Rodriguez, Yasmine Ryan, Hina Sugita. And then for the forwards, it's going to be 6 with Natalie Beckman, Hannah Belfort, Marissa Everett, Christine Sinclair, Sophia Smith, and Morgan Weaver.
It's very important to note that when Portland Thorns put out their preseason roster for 2022, 8 midfielders listed, 2 of them not available for the 2022 season. One being Crystal Dunn. She is pregnant and expected to give birth to her first child. Congratulations, Crystal, and her family growing. And also Angela Salem, who has retired. So their 8 midfielders actually drops down to 6 immediately, which takes their 24 player list to 22, which is tiny, right? Like 22 players on your preseason roster isn't that many, because most teams, they start with a higher number. That way they can offer contract extensions or contract signings to some of their newer, younger players that come into preseason, after they get a few days under their belt. So Portland, they don't have that much wiggle room with how they can expand and grow this roster at this point of preseason. So definitely super interesting to look at. I know that 6 forwards, that doesn't seem like a lot to me. Even 6 midfielders, that doesn't seem like a lot to me. We'll see though, because things will shake out, things will change around as they always do. Players go on loan and situations like that change. But I do love it, Sandra. I love looking at the preseason roster.
Yeah, it's with the 22 going from 24 to 22 players, right? When we sort of center in on the fact that Dunn is expecting and then Salem retires, we look ahead maybe to like a projected starting 11, right? Which is something that we've been doing on our previews, and it's like a smaller number to choose from. You know what I'm saying? Like select a starting 11. But I think even with some of the changes to personnel that the Portland Thorns went through in their offseason, there's a number of players on the preseason roster that you can point at and say, this is someone who's probably going to lace them up come opening day, right? And I think most of that you could see within maybe the defending core, right? I'm looking at somebody like, a Becky Sauerbrunn, somebody like a Menges, a Klingenberg, older, more veteran players who have been part of the club, part of the team, remain healthy. They're going to be there on day one for me. But I also am looking at somebody like a Kelly Hubley, right? Somebody who really had a really sort of a good kind of maybe breakout year perhaps for some folks back in 2021. And then obviously we're going to be keeping an eye on that midfield core to sort of see what the midfield's going to look like. But I don't think you go out and you sign a player, Japanese international in Sugita and not intend to use her, right? So my assumption is my assumption is going to be that we'll likely see her within the midfield as well. And then I don't think you have somebody like a Sophia Smith, right? Someone that you drafted so early, so young, going pro out of college, having the season that she put together, right, in 2021. I'm probably going to expect to see someone like her in that starting 11 as well. But in terms of maybe breaking down segments within this preseason roster when we're looking at a player who can be the young prospect to watch, right? When we're looking at a player who can is going to be the essential experienced player that this club might be leaning on, or even a player who we're looking at to make that next step. When it comes to any of those categories, particularly for young prospect, Lisa, who do you think we should be keeping an eye on here?
I don't want this to seem like an obvious answer for Portland's young prospect, but Olivia Moultrie, she is the young prospect that I think everyone needs to be keeping an eye on. She's 16 years old. Everyone had her eye on her last year in the 2021 season as a 15-year-old in the league, signing a professional contract. That was huge. It made headlines everywhere. And she had a lot of pressure on her. She did play. She got some minutes. She got some game time under her belt last year. But it was really just like pomp and circumstance for her. This year, I think that Olivia Moultrie can grow and really take that next step as a young prospect and a young player for Portland, especially when you're looking at the midfield unit for Portland, where they do have some of those holes. If she can be a player that steps up, it could be fantastic. She was recently called up to the United States Women's U20 national team for a training camp and looking ahead to CONCACAF U20 Women's Championship that is happening in the Dominican Republic. She's a player that is getting internationally recognized at the United States level. She's been recognized at the professional level already, but can she grow? And I think because she is so young, her ceiling is so much higher than any other young prospect in this league. Because even when you look at the other college draft picks that Portland has signed in Sam Coffey, who else did they sign? Hannah Belfort. They have college experience that Moultrie doesn't have, but Moultrie already has a year of professional experience under her belt. So keep an eye on Moultrie. See if she gets some starts, right? I think she could work her way into that starting lineup in the midfield, be a goal-scoring threat, be a big player that's circled on scouting reports for opponents, and be a game changer and a difference maker for Portland in this new era and this page that they're turning, especially in their midfield unit. I think we could see a different style, too, that Moultrie could bring to the game just with her youth and energy that she has. So she's my young prospect for sure. When you look at some of the experienced players that you're hoping to kind of step up and lead this team, who are you circling on your roster?
Yeah, I think when we talked earlier about that midfield, we're looking at that area as probably being the area for Portland where there's a lot of opportunity there. So I'm with you 100% on Olivia Moultrie in that there's a real opportunity for this player to maybe make some noise in 2022 and try to maybe seal a spot in that starting 11. But because of this sort of transition that this team is going to be making, I think this is also going to be another season where the club does rely a bit on their more experienced players. So there's a number of players on this roster that you could point to and say, this is going to be one of those players. But I think it's going to be maybe a defensive duo that they're going to be looking at and trying to rely on. And somebody like a Megan Klingenberg alongside maybe somebody in the center back with Emily Menges, right? Particularly with Klingenberg, another one of these players, I think that for some reason or other almost fell under the radar in terms of her level of play in 2021. This was someone who was, got the start at outside back, but was someone that we saw operating and running within the midfield or playing higher up in the pitch at moments when necessary for Portland Thorns. So doing a lot for the club, yes, on the pitch, but also clearly doing a lot for the club in the locker room, for the team in the locker room and off the pitch as well. She's always been somebody who's been able to be very vocal, in terms of speaking with and for on behalf of the locker room. And then even with somebody like a Menges who is bringing, all of that experience in the center back role on the pitch, but coming off of an offseason where she was one of these players who was integral, right, to sort of forming and ratifying this new CBA. We saw somebody like Menges really not just leaning on the pitch, but off of it as well for this club. So these are two players that I think we're both going to be looking at in terms of those experienced essential players that this club is going to be leaning on in 2020. But there's also players within this roster that we saw during 2021 that really took it to the next level, because it was an Olympic year in which the depth of certain clubs' benches had the opportunity to sort of show off. And one of those players that we found ourselves talking about a little bit was Kelly Hubley, Lisa. And I think you and I both agree that she is the player that we want to see be a sort of next step, next level player for Portland Thorns in 2022.
She is. Kelly Hubley is a player that hasn't had the spotlight. I mean, she's a defender for Portland, and she has seen minutes and seen game time, but it's often when a starting defender is out of the picture. She's their first one that they call in. So whether it was during the 2020 Tokyo Olympics that a number of backs were gone for Portland in Tokyo for the Olympics, Kelly Hubley stepped in, whether it's injuries that happen, whether it's international breaks that are happening. Kelly Hubley is the go-to gal for the defensive role to kind of slide in and do that. I want to see Kelly Hubley this year take the fate of her career into her own hands and make it so difficult that Portland coaches cannot take her off the pitch, because she's doing so well that no matter who comes back from international break, who recovers from their injury, and who can return to play, I want Kelly Hubley to make it so difficult for them to take her off the field, because she did that last year. We saw moments of it, moments of greatness from Kelly Hubley as a defender, to be able to slide into a center back role and be a leader, be an organizational vocal voice to keep the team in line and do a really good job defensively to not only make big stops, but then transition the play into offense, breaking lines, finding forwards' feet. So I want her to continue to be that player, but make it more consistent, be a day in, day out player that really challenges the starting position in the back line. Because when we look at the 22-player roster and who are going to be the starters, we talked about the back line and the defenders being a lot of those solid players in Menges and Becky Sauerbrunn and Klingenberg and Kuika. But can Kelly Hubley break into that line? She's someone that I'm really going to be keeping an eye on to see how consistent her play is, consistently intense and consistently aggressive and consistently defensive lock for Portland on defense.
I love it. I love to see DePaul Blue Demon thrive in NWSL. So I'm absolutely here to see the continued rise. Yes, I'm here to see the continued rise of Chicagoland defenders in the league. Let's keep it going. In terms of an international spotlight, this is 2022. We're about a year or so out plus from the 2023 World Cup. And on Portland, they've always been a team that's had a number of internationals in play, right? And we chatted a little bit already about who we thought is their biggest signing and who get it. But this is an area in which we wanted to maybe highlight a couple different players in terms of qualifiers for World Cups. And we're looking at players like Christine Sinclair, and we're looking at players like Rocky Rodriguez. For Sinclair in particular, this is one of those players that when we were taking a look at Portland's offseason, while maybe this is a team and fans are looking at the club like, hey, like you didn't make like a ton of new, big splash signings, I would argue that, having the introducing their Japanese international in the midfield with us to get it was one of those big signings. But I would also include maybe like the re-signings that they made for this club is probably an essential part of the process. I mean, locking up a legend like Sinclair to ensure like this is going to be a player who will always be a Portland Thorn is going to be huge, right? And I think this is a player that they will miss during World Cup qualifiers.
They will. And not only, looking at the re-signings, yes, Christine Sinclair is not going to another club, but she's also not retiring. They have her for one more year, which, of course, things can always change. But I think that was a big question mark for a lot of Portland Thorns fans. Will they see Christine Sinclair, who just won gold medal with Canada in the summer, is that the end of her career? But no, one more year. But yes, she's the international player that will be missing during qualifiers this summer and CONCACAF W Championship that will be taking place. Yeah, you have to look at Christine Sinclair as a re-signing and as a huge international spotlight.
Yeah, I'm also looking at Rocky Rodriguez for sure. This is the Costa Rican international who is likely to be missing perhaps a number of games with Portland Thorns in light of Costa Rica participating in what's going to be really soon some qualifiers that are taking place in CONCACAF during the month of February. But should they excel and succeed within that preliminary round of qualifiers, there is the potential for the CONCACAF W Championship qualifiers that take place in the summer as well. So there's a possibility that a player like Rodriguez, who is also another player that could be essential in that midfield, could be missing for a significant amount of time in 2022 as well. So I think talking about midfielders a lot, right, during this preview, it's leading us to our biggest burning question entering 2022 for Portland Thorns, which is who will be the key to Portland's midfield, Lisa?
For Portland, they need to find stable depth at the midfield position because, as you mentioned, players like Christine Sinclair, Rocky Rodriguez, they could be leaving for periods of time for World Cup qualifiers and CONCACAF matches happening. Even when you look at Japanese international, she could be leaving as well, Sungita. So I think it's finding the depth in the midfield for Portland because they don't have one player that can really dominate and do everything, which is what they had in the past. I mean, losing Angela Salem, losing Lindsay Haran, they create huge holes, which allows the opportunity for players like Olivia Moultrie to step in there and try some things. We've seen Yasmine Ryan get spurts and minutes for Portland Thorns. I don't think she's going to be a huge factor for the midfield for them. Rocky Rodriguez, she's had some inconsistencies, but getting more time at the international level will hopefully bring her level and increase that as well. Not having Crystal Dunn as well in the midfield. I mean, Haran and Dunn, all three of those players are out for this year. It's really who is going to step up, who is going to be the engine in the midfield for Portland. I mean, in years past, opponents go into play Portland, and the biggest question mark is how you're going to get through the midfield, whether it's trying to possess through the middle, that usually doesn't work, going up the flanks, or just sending it long and trying to find your forwards over the top line. I think for opponents, they're going to be licking their chops to get through Portland's midfield this season. So if Portland can work their way around their midfield, find depth and consistency in that position that doesn't fluctuate game to game, they're going to have to do that in order to stay on top in this league.
We'll keep an eye on it. We're going to be looking for the player to sort of grab that midfield right by the scruff and say, let's go. The projected finish in 2022 for Portland, again, just to remind folks, we did do a way too early power rankings early into the offseason back in December before a lot of these moves and additions took place. And we had put Portland Thorns at a number 3 finish in our power rankings. So in terms of a projected finish now, as offseason has concluded and preseason is in full swing, I think that we're going to be sticking with this club as a top team still. Definitely within the range of the top 4 and still maybe kind of ambitiously sticking with that number 3 standing, Lisa.
Yes, this is a top 4 team. I'm not sure if they'll get that top 1 or 2 spot, which earns them a first round bye. Not sure if they'll win the NWSL Shield this year, being the number 1 team at the end of the regular season, but a top 4 finish for sure. They'll secure a playoff spot with a little bit of wiggle room, and I think that they'll kind of choose their own destiny towards the end of the season, which is something that Portland has been known to do. A lot of teams did not do that at the end of 2021, but I think for Portland, a top 4 range. Yeah, I'll give them 3rd place projected finish for 2022 to end the season.
I'm with you on that. I want to thank everybody for listening to our Portland Thorns 2022 preview. Full team by team previews for all 12 clubs in the NWSL are coming up, so stay tuned. Drop us your thoughts about Portland on Twitter at Attacking Third or in the comments if you subscribe on YouTube at youtube.com/Attacking Third. Don't go anywhere. We have an exclusive interview with Portland Thorns forward Sophia Smith right after this quick break.